So what gives someone the right to defy a king? Today we're going to dive into a really radical theology of resistance. These are the revolutionary ideas that armed people not just with swords, but with the moral conviction to actually overthrow tyrants.
And it all kicks off with these words. I mean, think about it. This is a simple statement of conscience from a single monk that literally acts as a political earthquake, cracking the very foundations of absolute power in Europe.
You see, for centuries, the political world was, well, pretty simple and seemed totally unbreakable. Kings ruled with absolute authority. Their power was considered a divine right. End of story. But the Protestant Reformation, it wasn't just some church squabble. It was a political earthquake. It was like they were digging up this ancient, forgotten idea that every single ruler, no matter how powerful, answers to a higher authority, to God's law.
This was a complete 180 in political thought. I mean, the entire power structure got flipped right on its head. It was no longer the king is the law, but the law is king. Huge difference.
So how did a seismic shift like this even begin? Well, it starts with one man, Martin Luther, who, wasn't trying to start a political revolution at all, but he ended up defining the very limits of state power.
Okay, picture this. The year is 1521. Luther is standing before the Holy Roman Emperor. We're talking the most powerful man in Europe, and he's ordered to recant, to take it all back. His refusal sent shockwaves across the continent. He declared his conscience was bound not to any emperor, but to a higher authority. Now, this wasn't just some theological point. This was a political declaration.
And right out of this confrontation comes his two kingdoms doctrine. He basically argued that society is split into two realms. You've got the civil government, which handles all the external stuff, our bodies, our property, but then you have the spiritual realm, where God and God alone rules the soul. This drew a brand new, totally radical boundary for government power.
And here is the political bombshell. If the government cannot force your conscience, then its power is, by definition, limited. For the first time in centuries, a clear line was drawn in the sand that the state could not cross. It had zero jurisdiction over your faith.
But, okay, what if a ruler just ignores these limits? Well, the next major figure in our story, John Calvin, he takes this a big step further. He argued that a ruler's power wasn't just limited, it was conditional. For Calvin, rulers weren't the ultimate bosses. They were ministers of God. Think of them like public servants, whose whole job was to enforce a divine law that already existed. This meant they were accountable to a law they didn't create, and they certainly couldn't change.
And this is the core concept of conditional authority. A ruler's power is basically on loan. It's a trust, not a right.
So let's just walk through the logic here. It all starts with this idea of a covenant. It's like a sacred contract between the ruler and the people, under God. So the ruler is accountable to divine law. But, and here's the kicker, when tyranny breaks that contract, the ruler's legitimacy is just gone. They are no longer a rightful king, they're a usurper.
So that, of course, raises the next massive question. What happens when your ruler becomes a tyrant?
So is fighting back just simple rebellion, or is it something more? Could it actually be a duty? Well, thinkers like Theodore Beza and John Knox came up with a revolutionary answer that really did shift political thought forever.
And what's wild is how quickly this idea evolved. I mean, look at this. In just over 2 decades, it goes from John Knox's first arguments to Beza defining power as a trust, all the way to this book, Vindicia contra Tyrannos, which was basically a complete constitutional theory for how to resist.
And this led to a really crucial political idea, the doctrine of the lesser magistrates. Now, this wasn't a call for mob rule, not at all. It was a formal process for lawful resistance. The argument was that lower-level officials actually had a moral duty to step in and shield the people from a tyrant above them.
So, let's pull all of this together and really look at the incredible breakthrough that came out of this whole intellectual firestorm.
This right here, this is the ultimate takeaway. The Reformation didn't just reform the church, it completely redefined politics. It reframed resistance not as rebellion against God, but as obedience to God. Resisting a tyrant literally became an act of faithfulness.
This one powerful idea gave people the moral backbone they needed to stand up to absolute monarchs. It gave them the courage not just to tear down an old, broken system, but to start imagining a new one, which, as we know, eventually laid the groundwork for modern republics.
But look, after you tear down the old order, what are you going to build in its place?
A moral right to revolt is not enough. You need a new structure. And that, well, that's a story for our next explainer.
And this leaves us with one final thought to chew on. If these ideas were the very foundation for liberty, what happens when we forget them?